spokesman of God. And what's the general theme when you read these prophets? Repent. Okay, so it's a lot about telling people there are certain changes that need to be made in their lives, particularly Israel, obviously. But the countries or the peoples with whom they live, they're also, a part of it. But generally speaking, there's a problem, and I think to a certain extent, it's something that is very, very abruptly strong. I guess it'd be at least the way I can think of it now. That there's been a lot of things that have been happening. It didn't just happen. It's been going on for a long time. In this particular case, Ezekiel was sent, we've already gone over the first few chapters, to tell the people it's over. I'm not going to be listening to you per se, and I don't really want to get in any discussions about how God always will listen to people. But it had gotten to the point with these people where no talk was necessary other than this is what God says. And I think like most of us do when we're reading the Old Testament and reading the prophets, we get a little bit uncomfortable with it. It's pretty harsh. And if you're an individual that's kind of seen the way things are under Christ, that you're just not used to that kind of talk. You talk about people who are going to be condemned. When you talk about people for whom, God says, I have no pity for these people. And so this concept then of how does God react and interact with us, it's very important for us to try to accept what is said and not try to explain it simply in what we call New Testament terms. So when I was messing around with my slides, this font was about, I think it was about 36, and I just kind of blinked. And now that's what I got. And you just never quite know what these evil machines are going to do to you. All right. In chapter 3, we see that Ezekiel's the watchman. And we talked a little bit about the walls around the city and individuals who would be there to warn the people of things, whatever the circumstances may be. And so he was noted to be that. And then he starts off in his ministry, and of course, he has this incredible experience with the glory of God, I guess it's referred to in that way. And just like with Isaiah, you cannot have an experience like this where you are not going to say, God, what do you want me to do? This is really overwhelming. It's very, very powerful. We noted a couple of things here about you can't always measure success by conversions. I tried to explain that a little bit to you about how we need not get too hung up on this. But the whole idea is in this particular case, Ezekiel's to go preach. And he is told what about how his audience is going to be? Not receptive. But you're supposed to go do what? Ezekiel, keep on teaching. And, of course, in this smiley kind of world in which we live, we don't like that. It makes us uncomfortable. And we think if somebody preaches that strong, and I grant you that it's not exactly the same sort of climate that you read about in Ezekiel and the other prophets, but nevertheless, we have to approach it that way. And we have to do it with such a way to where we're consistent with the message and recognizing we need to teach what God says and what we learn from the Word of God. And then we want people to be changed by the message. God, I believe, wants them to be changed, but sometimes people just don't want to change. And probably most of us have had that sort of experience. So he explained to him, in reality, you're really not responsible for how these people react. I already know how they're going to react. They're not going to listen to you. And of course, if you were Ezekiel, how might you respond to that? Yeah, why are we going anyway? Tell me. Why are we doing this thing where I'm going to go in there and teach and the people aren't going to like me? And he seems to be able to handle that a little bit better. I talked about that with you. Jeremiah, on the other hand, a little bit more emotional, it seems, and really went through some really hard times, and he spends a lot of time crying and being disappointed. Ezekiel, he's one of those guys that might not be as happy as we'd like people to be. And maybe God selected him because someone was going to have a pretty tough skin, so to speak, when he goes out there and teaches these people. All right. We talked about these signs that were a part of Ezekiel's life, and then he created these things. God created these things so the people could be taught maybe about what's going to happen to them. And it's all, for the most part, when you look at it, the message is it's trying to, in one way or another, trying to say people are not going to respond, and they need to understand that the judgment has been made. Now, that doesn't mean, and we're going to notice that today, that in our efforts to try to understand this, sometimes we think, well, what's happening? I mean, are they all bad people? And for me, anyway, I will get to thinking that, well, yeah, they're not all that bad, but it seems like how can you be good amongst all of the kind of shenanigans that are going on? But we'll notice it's not made a big deal out of, but there's clearly some people there who were doing the right thing as much as they could. But he has given the reasons for severe judgment. So let's turn over to chapter 5. So anyone who's got it can feel free to read verses 5 and 6. Okay, so sin is sin, but there's some sin that's just something that just jumps out at you. And God will acknowledge that there are some sins that are really bad and deserve, I guess, a stronger form of judgment. And one of the things here is that these people were already, for the most part, surrounded and lived among Canaanite people. But the way God looks at it, as they lived there, of course, were they told that that was a good idea to go live among them? No, they were told that they shouldn't do that. And so when they get there, a lot of time transpires, but they end up being what? Better, great examples for the people who are there? Yeah, in fact, their behavior is even worse. So there are some value judgments, that God looks upon things, and that's something that is really considered to be wrong. These people they ought to be the people who are being examples, right? Do we agree with that? I mean, in the best of both worlds, if they had to be there, they would be expected to be people who are living in a righteous sort of way. Right, because they're God's people, and that's what they're supposed to do. But they were actually worse. And a couple of things, the barbarism I mentioned there, they actually ended up participating in cannibalism. And I don't know, when you look at in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 24, verse 10, those two passages I just don't even like to read. It just gives me the creeps to see what they did, that they were eating their children. And we're thinking, how can these people get so bad? that they would do that. And given the fact, and this is one of the reasons why God has decided, I am going to promise to you what I said I would do if you rebel against me or you don't living according to my word. You're going to not just hang around there. We're not going to play any games, so to speak, and you're out. Now, some of them are already out, right? Ezekiel over there on the other side of the river, and there's a number of people over there. Ezekiel's going to make a return visit, at least in the spirit, so to speak. But look at how God looks at their sin. So look at verse 11 and 12. Richard, if you can read your book there, could you? Give it a shot. That's what we like to hear. Yeah, go ahead.
Wherefore, as I live, saith the Lord God, surely because thou hast defiled my sanctuary with all thy detestable things, and with all thy abominations, therefore will I also diminish thee, neither shall mine eyes spare, neither will I have any pity. A third part of thee shall die with pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee. And a third part shall fall by the sword round about thee. And I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword with them.
Okay, so for those of us who say it doesn't matter what we do, God's going to forgive us. He promises that that's what he's going to do. Now, when you look at these two verses, and obviously I think this is something that works in principle, but the reality is this is under the law of Moses. I don't really think that really made a whole lot of difference. But when you think of that, what does God say? There will be what? No pity. Now, why would God get to that point? Well, I mean, like Dana says, well, why wouldn't he? As bad as things were. And I think that's a reasonable thing. But, don't you find yourselves wanting to say, well, yeah, but what if somebody is really sorry? God was not willing to look at these people that way. So I want us to think about this. I know when this is the sort of thing that's brought up, I mean, I realize that sin is transgression of the law. All right? And we often teach that everybody's at a place where they can be forgiven if they'll just decide they want to do the right thing. All right, now, that being true, and I think philosophically, I'm okay with that, and I think it's certainly a New Testament concept. But how is it that these people got to the point where God just says, I'm done with you? He doesn't say, now if you all turn around and come back. He's already told the preacher what? They're not going to listen. So God understands and knows what about these people? He knows their heart, and he knows that, yeah, and that's right. It's been put to them over and over again. Okay, I got some hands over here. Remember, guys, when you over on this area, this is one of my dead spots. So just got to do this. Go ahead, Clay. Right.
And had the abominations against God time and time and time again.
Yeah.
And God allowed them back in, and finally he had enough. And it's like, it's not me doing it to you, you have done it to yourself.
Yeah.
You have separated yourself from me.
Okay.
Now this is your release.
All right, so they created this atmosphere for themselves where God has gone as far as he's going to go with you. Now, go ahead, Jessica. Yeah.
They were breaking even the rules that the nations around them had, like even the moral codes and taboos that the other nations had. They had no reserve for them either. So they were actually a stench to the other nations too. The other nations would have been appalled by it as well.
And they at times were certainly more responsible. There were times when, like during the time of Josiah, when there's a return, and that only lasted a generation or so. But nevertheless, for the most part, they were ignoring God. And we'll read a verse that speaks to that and at least helps me to understand. So that's why they're getting such severe judgment. Anybody else want to have a whack? A what now? About Noah? Oh, okay. So that would be a parallel, you might think. Is that what you're saying? Okay, good point. All right. What's going to happen? This is interesting. The land is going to be destroyed. And, of course, it's God's talking to the land. He actually says, this is what's going to happen to you, you mountains. And it's a very fascinating technique that the Lord chooses. But, I mean, it's all going to be destroyed. But there will still be a remnant. Okay, let's look at Ezekiel 6, verse 8 through 10. Micah, can you read that?
However, I will leave a remnant for you, will have those who escape the sword among the nations when you are scattered among the countries. Then those of you who escape will remember me among the nations to which they will be carried captive, how I have been hurt by their adulterous hearts, which turned away from me, and by their eyes, which played the harlot after their idols. And they will loathe themselves in their own sight for the evils which they have committed, for all their abominations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. I have not said in vain that I would inflict this disaster on them.
Okay, so even though there's this general, vast judgment that's been placed upon the people, there are still some people there. Now, from a prophetic point of view, why is there a remnant of people? For the Messiah to come. The promise was stated that through the lineage of Abraham, and on down the line, there was going to be a Messiah that was going to come. So that tells us there's some good people that are still around. And that's another interesting thing, where God says, for the most part, you're all rebellious. And then so when God says that, and if you're somewhat of a literalist, what do you say? They're all bad. And then we find out that there are some people there. Now, that doesn't change what's right or wrong. It's just worth noting that there were some people who managed to take a stand, it would seem, and live life the way God wanted them to live it. So he tells them, destruction is near. And note how the decisiveness is described in words. And I make out for you some perspective here from chapter 7, verse 7 through 9. In other words, it had gotten to the point where it's time for the prophesying to stop, because God says that. So let's read 5 through 9. Someone to do that for me. Go ahead, Jessica. Nice and loud, Jessica.
Thus says the Lord God, disaster after disaster. Behold, it comes, an end has come, the end has come. It has awakened against you. Behold, it comes. Your doom has come to you, O inhabitant of the land. The time has come, the day is near, a day of tumult and not of joyful shouting on the mountains. Now I will soon pour out my wrath upon you and spend my anger against you, and judge you according to your ways. And I will punish you for all your abominations. And my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will punish you according to your ways, while your abominations are in your midst. Then you will know that I am the Lord who strikes.
Okay. Does it look like something's going to happen? Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine how this could be affirmed in any stronger way. It's going to happen. Of course, we know that this is the second wave of the people of Israel. There's the north and south kingdoms. Northern kingdom, they're already gone, as much as they could be gone. And then this is the southern kingdom, where what is located? Principally, city of Jerusalem and the temple, and that's going to be also found an end to. All right, so it's going to happen. God just says, I've had it. I'm not going to put up with it anymore. Again, somebody help me with this. I mean, just go ahead, because I want to make sure that we understand this. How God can be so adamant that I'm going to destroy these people, but at the same time recognizing there's going to be a remnant. And so there are going to be some people who aren't going to be destroyed. Yeah, Rob.
Well, I think you see this pattern throughout the scripture. Anytime God brings a great destruction, there's always someone who is spared. I mean, Janine brought up Noah. We can go all the way back to the flood. There was a remnant. You can look at Noah as a remnant
Right.
that is left. And we see this prophesied in Isaiah that there would be a remnant for the northern
Right.
kingdom, that there's a remnant that we see Jeremiah's missaid remnant. And we see this pattern even in Revelation when God is denouncing Sardis. He says that there are some among you that still have white clothes.
Right.
And take example of those with white clothes. Even though he's denouncing the entire congregation, he still says there's a remnant there. There's a number that are there. So
Right.
this is something I think we always see with God is when there is great destruction, there's still, God never totally annihilates. There's always something left.
Right. And so I would say that we could probably assess that in every congregation that's trying to live faithfully to God, and maybe they have a lot of people who aren't, that there probably are some people there that are trying to do their best to serve the Lord. Now, again, it's one of these things where God has just said, as far as the mass of the situation, the people as a whole, they're done. But there are people there who are. Now, he doesn't necessarily go around bragging about those people. He just announces that they're there, and some of them are going to be saved. All right, so in chapter 7, we get into the kind of things that are actually going to happen. If you want to know what the judgment is, here's how it's going to look. So let's go ahead and go to chapter 7, and we're going to read 10 through 25. And so have your finger in the Bible if you're willing to read, and because I want to read all of it. The first thing is there's going to be great social disruption. All right, chapter 7, verse 10 through 13. Go ahead, Robert. You're warmed up.
Behold the day, behold, it is coming. Your doom has gone forth, the rod has budded, arrogance has blossomed. Violence has grown into a rod of wickedness. None of them shall remain, none of their people, none of their wealth, nor anything eminent among them. The time has come, the day has arrived. Let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller mourn, for wrath is against all their multitude. Indeed, the seller will not regain what he has sold as long as they both live, for the vision regarding all their multitude will not be averted, nor will any of them maintain his life by his iniquity.
Okay, so the very fabric of society is just not going to be there any longer, and it's going to break down in different ways. There was going to be the military. Anybody back there? Larry, would you read that? Verse 14 through 18.
They have blown the trumpet, they have made all things ready, but no one will go into battle. For my wrath is on the whole crowd. Outside is the sword, inside are plague and famine. Those in the country will die by the sword, and those in the city will be devoured by famine and plague. The fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains like doves of the valley. They will all moan, each for their
All right, now I want you to think about this just in a relative sense. Right? We look at our society today. How do most of us look at it? Things are going just great, right? No. I think most of us would assess, as Dana says, we're a mess. Now, but when you look at this, these people are really a mess, and it's going to get messier. So I'm not diminishing at all the amount of sin that's out there in the world, but I think at least for us, we don't, even though God may be acting in some way right now, providentially, we do not recognize it as to be something to this level. So it may not be there yet. Maybe it's going to happen. But read 19 through 22. James, go ahead. You're nice and loud, James, again.
They shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. As for the beauty of his ornament, he set it in majesty, but they made the image of their abominations and of their detestable things therein. Therefore have I set it far from them. And I will give it into the hands of the strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall pollute it. My face will I turn also from them, and they shall pollute my secret place. The robbers shall enter into it and defile it.
Okay. What do most of us think about inflation? It's building character, isn't it, Christine? Yeah. Yeah, well, think about this. I mean, this is to the extreme. He says you might as well take your money, and some of you might say this because we've all seen diminished value of our money. But he says you might as well just take the coins, whatever you got, just throw it out in the street. It's no good. That's how bad it's going to be. Now, it's not that bad here. It seems like we're moving that way. But nevertheless, just understand, this is when God really decides he's going to judge someone, and he has the right to do it because he is God, just like in the case of Noah, because of the wickedness of the people. But this is how it's going to look. So some of them are probably thinking, okay, we'll probably come through this all right, right? We'll survive this. Most of us believe that something bad's going to happen. The nation certainly doesn't have a grand future, but most of us all think of it in these terms, especially if you're over 70 years old. It's not going to happen in my life. That's just, we just have this escapism thing, about it. It'll always happen to the next people who come along. Well, these people might have had some sort of conversation like that, but nevertheless, this was going to be as complete can be. Chapter 8 explains what we probably would think would be at the core of the problem is these people are amongst idolatrous people, and they're joining in with them. And I mean, it's interesting because there's cults that are mentioned there. There are groups that are mentioned there that they were worshiping a Tammuz, that's called in certain of the translations a god of vegetation. Sometimes it's related more to sexual effects, the god of fertility. But there are people there who were worshiping that God. Now, I mean, how does that happen? When you got the guys over there in the temple supposedly teaching the law. Of course, what do you find out about these things? Where are they being worshipped? In the temple. Well, they were trying to be in secret. Yeah, but Ezekiel was able to get through the wall and check it out. But, I mean, they were thinking they were not being noticed, and that'll come out a little bit later on. But this is also what they're doing. 7 through 13. Dave Stitt, can you read that for me? 7 through 13 of chapter 8.
So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig into the wall, and when I dug into the wall, there was a door. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there. So I went in and saw, and there every sort of creeping thing, abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel, portrayed all around on the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, and in their midst stood Jezaniah and the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up.
Okay,
13.
up to 13 if you...
Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the room of his idols? For they say, The Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. And he said to me, Turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing.
Okay, going back to Carol's point, there's a sense in which they're hiding. But here they are, they're the leaders, supposedly, who are still around, and they're thinking that they're hiding. And there's a certain logic to their thinking, and why do they think that this is probably not being noticed? It's stupid, but anyway, there's a certain amount of logic to it. Yeah, well, they think God has already kind of given up on everything, so it doesn't really matter anymore. We've gotten so bad that he doesn't care about us anymore. And so they actually think they're getting away with it. They have no character, as far as I can see. And these were the supposed leaders of the people from a spiritual point of view. Now, we're trying to build the case for why is God doing this? And I think for most of us, the idea of idolatry would have been something that would have jumped right up. But there are so many other things, that are going on. But nevertheless, they're even worshiping the sun. Now, I realize in the society in which we live, people would probably applaud anybody who's worshiping those gods. Because that would sort of say you're not tied to those biblical concepts. But there were people who knew that this wasn't right, but most of them aren't around anymore. So that's what they're doing. Now, it's important for us to understand in the simple way that my mind works, and we know it's not that complicated, but to understand that God was at the point with these people where we're not going back. So we need to get out of our minds, well, what if a bunch of people repented? Well, did that ever happen? What about Nineveh? Well, that happened there, didn't it, Robert? I'll shake your head. Okay, well, don't say it then. Nineveh, did they repent? Yeah, did they kind of look like, at least the way they're presented, they don't look like the people who are going to repent. Okay, Robert, I get 2 minutes, go. Yeah.
This isn't just, there's a little bit of idolatry in the nation, I'll bring forth a
Sure.
king and we'll wipe it out. It's in the foundations. It's
Right.
in the very walls. And that's, I think, something we all should sort of take note of is sometimes the corruption, the sin, whatever it might be, can sink so deeply into the places that we are that we don't even realize that it's there. It's in the walls. It's part of the place.
Yeah, because I think some people might have said, that's going on inside the walls of the temple? Oh, no, that can't be true. Do you know who these guys are in there? So it's important for us to understand just how far they had gotten. And they really believe, and I don't really blame them for this one, because things are going so downhill that it'd be very easy for them to think, see, God's already judging us, and we deserve the judgment. And so, hey, let's just go ahead and have a good time. Or let's worship some of the gods that are around us that other people are worshiping. So what's going to happen? The wicked are going to be slaughtered while the righteous are spared. So there's our remnant right there. Again, there's not a lot of congratulations to those who are the remnant. Because that's not really the emphasis that I understand when most of the prophets are writing. They're writing to the leaders, they're writing to those who are so much involved in really destroying the country. But there were people there that were there. In the beginning, when it was going to, the wicked are going to begin to face what they're going to face. 6 men go forward with weapons meant for the uncaring, disobedient. Now, whether this was a miraculous event in some way by the various angels from heaven or something like that, or if this is just saying, look, there are people who are just going to go in there and they're going to have weapons and they're going to find, the uncaring people and going to kill them. So, but how's he going to be able to decide who's what? All right, one man goes about putting a mark on those who mourn over the downfall of the nation. So, read verse 4. Let's see. Justin, could you read that? Just read verse 4 of chapter 9. Okay, so we could maybe look at this and make some sort of connection to the book of Revelation. I see that, but it doesn't really help as far as I can see in terms of helping us to understand that somebody, it's really interesting the way he's described. Did that show up in the reading just then? It's like he's walking around he's got a pencil and he's got his equipment to be able to make this mark on people. Yeah. Yeah. So now, there's just one of them, so that tells us, maybe that also is evidence that there's not too many people. Yeah. But nevertheless, that's what he's doing. So the people would know. So those guys who've got the weapons will not go around killing them. And again, so what's the reason that God gives for this destruction of the people still living in the land? Verse 9 and 10. Scott, could you read that for us?
Then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is very, very great. And the land is filled with blood, and the city is full of perversion. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. But as for me, my eye will have no pity, nor will I spare, but I will bring their conduct upon their heads.
So things are just so evil that it even sort of shows up in the land. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, the bloodshed. I mean, if you watch the channels, the crime channels, and now that we have DNA, and you go in there and you find all the blood and everything like that, and you're going, wow, this really looks like a bad murder. But it's there, the evidence. Now, in that sense, that's what I'm thinking of. I don't think it's literal, but I'm just saying that God gives the reason for the destruction of these people and how they're treating the land and how they're living in the land. All right, now, let's go ahead and read a couple more verses and then we'll finish up in chapter 9. Now, next week is singing, so it'll be 2 weeks between now and the next class, and that will be covering chapter 10 through 12. So notice now the summary in verse 9 of chapter 9. Then he said to me, who's the he? God. Who's the me? Ezekiel. The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is very, very great. And the land is filled with blood, and the city is full of perversion, for they say, again, what? The Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. It's not easy to be the one who's really standing out amongst a bunch of people who don't have any respect for God or for anything related to it. It takes character to do that. We know in theory, it makes sense. Who do I obey? Man or God? Well, it's God. But sometimes you can get kind of, frustrated with the whole thing. And I know people, who've left churches, because I don't know if they were right, but, it's just such a den of iniquity, and I just don't want to be there anymore. Now, in many cases, that person is usually related very much to the problems that are going on. At least that's my experience. But, the point is that I want to do right. And I realize that, and you do too, that you'd like to have everybody around you in the same fight. But we know that's just not the way it works. So we have to determine our own heart to be servants of God. But as it says there, look now at verse 10, it says, "But as for me, my eye will have no pity, nor will I spare." The Lord is determined to throw that in there. "But I will bring their conduct upon their heads." Now, what kind of lessons are we supposed to learn about this in terms of our relationship with sin? Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, okay. That when you do what's wrong, ultimately God will judge, and you'll receive whatever punishment that God desires. Now, but one of the things that this teaches us, and then I'll quit, is that you can see how much God hates sin. So what kind of lesson does that make for you, or make for me? But yeah, go ahead, Dana.
So these people are to the place where they're so comfortable in their sin that they know God's deserted us. We may as well just continue sinning.
Yeah.
And that's our lesson.
Okay.
Is that we can get to that place where we
Yeah.
no longer are affected by our sin. We just live in it because that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and it can be real petty stuff. It could be, it just seems like I got to go down there and vacuum, all the time. And these people around here don't have to. They get away with it. Oh, life is just so terrible. Go ahead, Mitch. Sure. Right. Absolutely. And that is the end of sin. But of course, for us, yeah. Yeah. But we know that Jesus is there ready to forgive us. All right, now we know that we can go too far, and our minds are not in the place of being able to seek forgiveness. But nevertheless, don't just say, "Oh, God's going to forgive me, and I'll check in, a couple hours before I die." Go ahead, Justin.
I also think of there's the verses that say that they're lying to themselves, saying, "Oh, God doesn't see."
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's one of the first things you learn as a little kid and threaten your siblings with, "God knows."
Yeah.
And it's true. He sees all.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The older you get, the more you can convince yourself He's not seeing it. Yeah. Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. That's it. Thank you. Oh, what? Go ahead. Oh, okay. Get a deacon to bring it down properly. That would be. All right, read it loud there.
This is from her granddaughter going. Said, we're needing someone to be with her this Friday who would know how to help her get up and down and to the bathroom from about noon to 5 when her helper will be away. So if you or anyone you know can think of anyone, let me know. I will be there the whole time to tell them what to do, but we still need someone experienced in moving injured people.
Okay. You know who you are. Those of you who are experienced at that. And we, is that from Lauren? Yeah, okay. And she's very happy with the help that they've got coming in. But, sometimes they're not going to be there. But most of the times they will be. Okay? All right, that's it.